all the way from Australia here today, and also the Australian ambassador. Thank you so much for this cooperative effort. This is a seminar that we organize jointly with the Australian embassy. So thank you so much for that. Right now in Europe, we are facing this somewhat return to Cold War dynamics. We're talking a lot about Ukraine, Russia, looking back in time. A Russian colleague of mine said, I feel 25 years younger. But still we are left with this question, is this just a bump in the road? Or do we see a significant shift? At the same time, this occurs on a backdrop where there's some significant long-term developments going on in Asia. And at our institute, we would like to kind of have an eye to both of these developments. So I don't think they're closer developments in Europe, but also, of course, the long-term economic and political power shifts that we are experiencing. And so one of the things that we do this spring is to organize a series of lectures. And I'd just like to have a brief advertising campaign for what. So today we kick it off with Michael's, and then we have a lecture 21st of May on the pharmaceutical industry in India. It's not so specifically related to this topic, but it's related to our Asia effort. And then 22nd of May, the day after, we will organize an event at the Litteraturhuset, where the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Børge Brende, will outline some of the government's Asia strategy. And we will also present a study that we have conducted here at our institute, mapping out Norway's relationship to various Asian countries. In addition, we have some Korean scholars who have covered on this project, and they will map out some of the economic dynamics in Asia, looking at the different regional trade agreements, etc. So looking into the prospect for economic cooperation in Asia. And then in the beginning of June, we will have a scholar from Taiwan coming here to talk about Taiwan, mainland China developments. And then we round off with maritime security in East Asia in the beginning of June. So, Michael, it's a pleasure to have you here, coming to kind of introduce this series somehow of lectures. And I don't know if I need to give you a more presentation, but introduction. Michael Wesley is a professor and director of IPS at the Australian National University. He has published extensively and also has authored several books on foreign policy. And he has been a prominent person in Australian public life also, having different positions. He also was a kind of colleague of mine as a director of the Law Institute. So, his remarks will go on for 20, 25, 30 minutes or something. And then Idra Överland, one of our energy experts, he will make some comments or discussion, introduce the discussion, and then we'll give the floor, open the floor for remarks. So please, Michael, go ahead. Should I say you left some advertising material?
Yes. There is some for people who are either students themselves or have students who would be interested in perhaps coming to Australia to study Asian affairs and international affairs. I've left some propaganda material down the front here, so please help yourself to that. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak at Newby. It's a wonderful opportunity, and thank you too to Damien Miller and Rebecca at the Australian Embassy for organising things as well. My task today was given to me by a group of Nordic ambassadors that I had lunch with a little over a week ago at the Danish ambassador's residence in Canberra. I said to them when I was having lunch with them, I said, what should I talk about when I go to the Nordic countries? And they said, your task is to convince people that what is happening in Asia is at least as important as what is happening in the Ukraine or the Middle East, in Syria, or in Africa. Your task is to convince people that that what is happening in Asia is in fact of paramount importance. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. So let me begin, and my apologies if I go quite quickly through this material, but I want to leave a lot of time for discussion. This is one of my favourite maps. The reason this is one of my favourite maps is that more people live inside of this circle than outside of it. And back when this circle contained countries that were poor and not very economically productive and internally divided and internally focused, it was perhaps legitimate to say that Asia didn't really matter. But the fact is that something really major has happened, particularly in the last 15 years or so, perhaps even longer. What we have seen inside of that circle with all of those people has been really quite explosive economic growth. In fact, some of the most explosive economic growth. And it's reversed what the economic historian Kenneth Pomerantz has called the Great Divergence. What Pomerantz means by this argument is that for most of human history, a society's proportion of the global population was equal in approximate terms to that society's proportion of global productivity. So, for example, if we go back to the year 1500, China, the society of China, had about 23% of the global population and was responsible for 25–26% of global economic productivity. Now, what of course happened was that in the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution came to Europe and to its offshoots in North America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. And the great divergence occurred. And by this, Pomerantz means that suddenly that proportionality between population and productivity was broken. And so if you take the year 1975, a little bit earlier than this chart shows, in 1975, China had about 24% of global population, but was responsible for less than 5% of global economic output. At the same time, the societies of Europe and North America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, had around about 23–24% of global population, but were responsible for around 76% of global economic productivity. And so what has happened, I think, in recent years, particularly since the 1990s, has been the sudden reversal of that and the dawning of what I call the age of proportionality. Because of changes in the global economy, because of new connectivities, we are starting to see a reassertion of that correspondence between proportion of global population and contribution to global productivity. And you can see here that China and India are starting to rise and will probably continue to rise to levels of contribution to global productivity around about proportional to their level of contribution to global population. We can see here another chart that shows growth in GDP per capita over the last 10 years or so, and it shows that really the big gainers in terms of the blue lines there are really the big societies of Asia. And so this level of growth within that small circle of the of the Earth's surface will likely continue into the future. Now, this has a number of effects, and these effects have security consequences. One is the growth in the middle class in this part of the world. Now, political scientists going back to Aristotle have often written that the middle class is a stabilizing factor in political affairs and in economic affairs. They suggest that the middle class has a stake in stable economies, stable politics, and so on. I'm not so sure about that. I think there is at least as much evidence that the middle class, and a rapidly growing middle class, can be a destabilizing factor. I think if you look at some of the Arab Spring revolutions, if you look at the unrest in places like Turkey and Thailand and Brazil, you can start to see that the unrest, the people on the streets, is driven by large amounts of middle-class dissatisfaction. And what I would like to suggest is that the rapidly growing middle class does two things to these very large Asian societies. The first one, have very high rates of consumption, particularly of energy, and I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. But they also have very high demands. They have high demands in terms of their own lifestyle, but they have high demands in terms of their expectations of politics, and particularly their expectations of how their own countries act in the world. This is quite a busy map, but what this shows is the growth in urbanisation. One of the great consequences of rapid economic development is urbanisation. That has happened across nearly all societies that have developed and modernised quickly, and Asia is no exception. As you can see from this chart, the countries in blue are those between 25% and 49% urban. And as you can see, the two largest societies have a long way of urbanisation to go. The process of urbanisation will continue into the 21st century, and this will be one of the big trends in Asia. And the implication of this for energy is again demonstrated, because urban societies are again much more energy dependent, particularly on certain forms of energy. And this plays into the story I would like to tell in a few moments. A couple more charts on the consequences of rapid economic growth. This is a chart that shows the uptake of new consumer technologies in countries that are developing rather quickly, and it tells one particular story. If you go back to early technologies like the telephone, the car, the refrigerator, the radio, it takes a relatively long time for societies to universalize the use of these things. The interesting thing about this chart for me is that the newer technologies like the internet, the cell phone, the computer and so on have much more rapid uptake, and it's a much more rapid uptake across societies, including developing societies. We now live in a world where there are many more users of mobile phone technology and internet technology in the developing world than there are in the developed world. So this plays into a broader story, not only of energy usage, but middle class expectations and middle class desires for what their governments do. The next part of my story is to start to look in more detail at the energy picture, the energy consequences of Asia's rapid development. This is a chart that shows the energy intensity of economic development. And it's something that is almost an iron rule of rapid economic development, that the energy intensity of rapid economic development is extremely high. Let me give you an example. In the United States, during the 20th century, energy consumption rose at 4 times the rate of growth in GDP. So 4 times the rate of growth in energy consumption as in GDP. And the preliminary figures from the economic development of Asia show a similar rate of the growth of energy intensity. And of course, the types of energy that are being used are important as well. The increasing move from forms of biofuels towards what's known as modern energy, electricity, gas, oil, and to an extent renewables. The global energy consumption picture, according to the IEA, is about a quarter, a quarter, a quarter. A quarter coal, a quarter oil, a quarter gas, and a quarter everything else, biofuels, renewables, nuclear, and so on. And that looks like the energy picture into the future for a while. But the story out of this is that the growth in developing Asia, the economic growth in developing Asia, has been extremely energy intensive. And it shows in the following charts. This is a chart, again, using International Energy Agency figures, and again, using quite conservative estimates in the growth of net oil import dependence. The important thing to realise about that particular circle of the Earth's surface that we started with is that it's not particularly well endowed with modern sources of energy. Or the parts that are relatively well endowed with modern sources of energy are using energy at such a rate that it is outstripping their ability to produce that energy. China, up until 1993, was a net oil exporter. It has some of the largest reserves of oil and gas in Pacific Asia, and yet the rate of China's demand for energy, the rate of China's demand for oil and gas has completely outstripped the ability of China to satisfy it. India is even more poorly endowed with energy resources. And the countries of Southeast Asia, the yellow line here, began the 1980s with really quite significant reserves of oil and gas. Over time, economic growth in Southeast Asia has changed the region from being a net energy exporter to a net energy importer over time. This is another chart that shows over the next to 2035 exactly what the energy situation will be. And it shows, again, the major big economies of Asia will become even more so net gas and oil importers. Japan and Korea are about as far along the line as you can possibly go. And Indonesia and Southeast Asia are going to go from, probably a little less being net gas exporters and net oil importers. So the basic picture here is that Asia is going towards increasing dependence on energy imports. The next part of my story is where these imports are going to come from. But before I do that, let me just give you a few figures about Asia's energy demand. According to the International Energy Agency, 63% of the growth in global energy demand for the year 2040 will come from developing Asia. China will constitute 31% of that, India 18% of that, and Southeast Asia 11%. China and India today constitute 1/4 of all global energy consumption. By 2040, they will constitute 1/3 of all global energy consumption. Let me talk a little bit about where a lot of this energy is coming from. This is a chart of easily recoverable reserves, according to the US Geological Survey, and it shows that really the very large reserves still are in the Gulf region. And the fact is that one of the iron laws of energy is that because energy is bulky and it's heavy, and it's often has to be transported through maritime routes, countries tend to get their energy from close to home. The closer the supplies of energy are, the cheaper it is to bring energy to them. And so there has been a global regionalising of energy consumption and production over some time now. And it means really that increasingly the big energy consuming countries of Asia will rely on the Gulf region for their energy. Let me give you a few more figures around this. In 1990, 1/2 of Asia's oil came from the Gulf region. Today, in 1990, 1/3 of Asia's oil came from the Gulf region. Today, it's 1/2. China today gets 51% of its oil from the Gulf. In 20 years, it will get 3/4 of its oil from the Gulf region. Today, Japan receives 83% of its oil from the Gulf, India 64%, and the Republic of Korea 85%. So this is an important relationship. In many ways, it is tying the different parts of Asia together in this increasingly important energy trade. East, Southeast, South and West Asia are starting to be knitted together in important ways. And again, a few more figures for you. Saudi Arabia exports 3 times more oil to the 5 largest Asian customers than it exports to the EU and the United States put together. Saudi Aramco is the big state-owned oil company in Saudi Arabia, is the single biggest supplier of oil to China, Japan, India, Republic of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and the Philippines. Now, this is an interesting and I think very significant security relationship. Let's hone in on the relationship between China and Saudi Arabia. 2 very different countries, 2 very different economies at different ends of the continent. And yet this relationship has become highly significant over the years. In many ways, the Chinese economy, an authoritarian regime that is reliant on high rates of economic growth in order to satisfy that growing middle class and to ensure social stability, is increasingly dependent on stable, dependable supplies of affordable oil. And Saudi Arabia, over many years, has demonstrated itself to be committed with all of these big oil reserves to stabilizing the global oil economy. So in many ways, China has become increasingly dependent on Saudi Arabia as a central plank in its energy supply security. But let's flip the equation around the other way and look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is an absolutist monarchy. It has a very rapidly growing population. 1/2 of the Saudi population is under the age of 24. 90% of the Saudi population is under the age of 50. And let's face it, the Saudis rely on oil revenues. 75% of government revenues come from oil exports, and the Saudis rely on transfers, government transfers, to the population in order to ensure social peace. As an example, after the Arab Spring uprisings across the Middle East, the Saudi monarchy committed $100 billion to building social housing in Saudi Arabia and funded 60,000 more jobs for Saudi Arabians in the security industry. And so for a country like Saudi Arabia, China represents a remarkable source of demand security, a country whose energy demands are going to increase over time into the foreseeable future, and therefore you see an increasingly significant security relationship forged between Saudi Arabia and China. And it reflects in some of the trade figures. You can see a remarkable growth in cross-Asian trade, much more significant than Asia-Pacific trade, the trade across the Pacific Ocean over the last 10 or 20 years. Another aspect of interdependence that's important to realise is that of what economists call global production sharing. Asia is the most advanced region in the world in terms of global production sharing. The manufacture of component parts in different countries, and they're coming together to make the finished product. This is a map of the global production sharing behind the Thai auto industry, and it shows the different component parts that are made in different countries in Asia. And the fact is that the economies of Asia produce 39% of the world's component parts, a remarkable number. Components comprise 35% of Asia's internal trade, compared to 22% of the global average. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, 44% of Southeast Asia's manufacturing output is in component parts. So this is another way that the economies of Asia are starting to be knitted together. So one of the stories I wanted to tell you about the security situation in Asia is a growth of remarkable interdependence, remarkable economic interdependence. But the other side of this is a growth of remarkable rivalry. The incredible economic growth that we've seen in that circle that I started off with was the result of a period of peace that broadly can map onto the last quarter of the 20th century. Between the end of the Vietnam War in 1975 and the end of the 20th century, you had a remarkable period of stability and peace in Asia. And my contention today is one of the major reasons for that is that there was no country in the region that was large enough and wealthy enough and internally unified enough to be able to contemplate regional leadership. And that has changed. That has changed really quite dramatically. We now have a country that is large enough, is wealthy enough, and is internally united enough to be able to contemplate a bid for regional leadership. My point here is not necessarily that China does contemplate regional leadership. In fact, there's a significant amount of evidence to suggest that China is still debating what its future will be in the region. My point is that other countries can imagine China making a bid for regional leadership, and it makes certain of them very, very nervous. Around China, there are a group of countries that either have existing territorial disputes with it, or have fought past wars with China, or have these relationships of rivalry with it. I would include Japan here, Vietnam, Indonesia and India. Countries that I think feel deeply uncomfortable with the thought of an Asian region that has China as the regional leader, the regional hegemon, to use international relations jargon. And so we have a rising process of rivalry. Each of these countries, even Vietnam, which a generation ago was at war with the United States, has tightened its security relationship with the US. And even more importantly, they have tightened their security relations with each other. So a good example here is the relationship that is developing very quickly between India and Japan. Two very different countries, situated a long way apart, and yet they are increasingly building a relationship with each other. A lot of Japanese investment, particularly in infrastructure, flowing into India. These are not alliances in any sense of the word, but they are mutual security relationships in that Japan is very clearly investing in the rise of countries like India and Vietnam as a way of counterbalancing the rise of Chinese power. I'm not going to dwell on this, but there is a third layer of rivalry of countries that surround these second-tier powers that are somewhat nervous about their own rise and therefore tend to be developing strong relations with China. My point here, ladies and gentlemen, is across Asia we have a new form of dynamics, and it's a form of dynamics that I call rivalrous interdependence. We have these two opposite trends, if you like. One is the deepening interdependence in energy and manufacturing and other forms of interdependence. The other one is a deepening rivalry. And I believe that these two trends will continue to exist for most of this century. The rivalry will not be resolved in an all-out conflict because of the levels of interdependence involved. Even if the great powers of Asia did decide to go to war, they wouldn't be able to fuel their war for very long. It's as simple as that. And so the rivalry cannot work itself out, if you like, because of the interdependence. On the same token, the interdependence will not develop into EU-style institutions because of the deep rivalry and suspicions in Asia. And I think that is the basic way that this will work. I think what this means, and this is gaining increasing currency in Australia and parts of Asia, is that we live in an Indo-Pacific age, a realm, a strategic and economic realm that stretches from the Gulf region around the coasts of India up through Southeast Asia to the islands of Japan and Korea. And the important thing is that this is driving significant arms acquisition. We are starting to see in Asia what the British scholar Geoffrey Till has called a slow motion arms race, particularly in the maritime realm. I think, for example, that China is very worried that so much of its energy comes in across sea lanes that are controlled by the US Navy. I think it is no coincidence that the Indian Navy is growing very strongly, and India wants a two-carrier group navy, one in the Arabian Sea, one in the Bay of Bengal. And this complies to a logic of what strategists call horizontal escalation. The ability, if the United States and China, for example, clash in the South China Sea, instead of escalating here, vertical escalation, and threatening a nuclear exchange, the United States has the option of saying to China, back down in the South China Sea, or we will cut off your energy supplies in the Indian Ocean. So displacing the escalation, displacing the conflict, and I think my interpretation of a lot of the arms spending that is happening at the moment is moving towards this logic of horizontal escalation. That is CIPRI's estimation of the growth in weapons expenditures in the region. Of course, China is the major mover in this area, but we're starting to see really quite rapid escalations in acquisitions in some other countries. Very quickly, to finish off, I think eventually we'll start to see the real rivalries coalesce around 3 peninsulas and 3 bays in the Indo-Pacific realm. Let me talk very quickly about them. The West Pacific Peninsula starts in the islands of Japan, comes down through the Ryukyu Islands, through Taiwan, and into the Philippines. The South Pacific Peninsula starts in Pakistan, goes through India, and all the way down to Sri Lanka. The importance of these 2 peninsulas is as follows. China feels constrained by the fact that all of these territories are controlled either by countries that it sees as antagonistic to China or allies of the United States. And China believes that this, which it calls the first island chain, unless China can assert some sort of control over the first island chain, it is constrained in being able to project force out into the Pacific Ocean. As long as US allies control these territories, the US Navy can sail up and down the Chinese coastline, gathering intelligence. And I think that is the key issue that is happening in the South China Sea. In a strange sort of parallel way, India also feels constrained and held back by its own peninsula. It feels that while it has antagonistic relations with Pakistan, difficult relations with Bangladesh, difficult relations at times with Sri Lanka, that it can never really project power in the maritime sense either. And so both of the giant powers of Asia are fixated on solving these 2 peninsular problems. In the middle, there is this Indo-Pacific peninsula, starting in Thailand, going down through Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and into Australia. Of course, it is the land bridge that divides the Pacific from the Indian Ocean. It is divided by a number of strategically significant straits. Any country, any great power that can assert a sphere of influence over the Indo-Pacific Peninsula is enabled to project power either way into the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. The 3 bays are the South China Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the Arabian Sea. Basically, the ability for China to control or assert leadership in the South China Sea goes a long way for it to be able to neutralize the first island chain, to be able to gain secure access through the Straits of Malacca. India, on the other hand, I think is equally bent on establishing a sphere of influence in the Bay of Bengal. And a lot of Indian weapons investments have been in that part of the world. The Arabian Sea at the moment, of course, it is the entrance and exit to the Gulf. The Chinese have been building a port here at Gwadar in Pakistan. I think once that becomes operational, and if it becomes operational, we'll start to see real competition for the Bay of Bengal as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've probably gone on a little bit too long, so my apologies for that. But I believe that is the shape of things to come, and that is why Asia matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think you were successful in your mission. You can report back to the Nordic ambassadors that I think you brought the attention to the region, and you got a lot of important information on why this region is likely to become even more important in the future. Now I give the floor to Ida Øverland, who's heading more energy research and also an expert on Russian politics. Please.
Thank you. And thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I guess the first thing I would like to say is how can we get hold of the PowerPoint slides? I'm sure everybody here is very envious. And as Ulf said, you can really say mission accomplished. You really solved the importance of Asia, which of course includes Australia, or not includes Australia, but which Australia is very close to, much closer than us. And I think it was very, what really made your presentation very interesting was that you managed to link some domestic development, some sociological aspects like the middle class and demographics with what's happening internationally to show, point to some really important trends. So I think it's we could hardly wish for a better introduction of our series of Asia-related events. Really good. I expect Ruth is also very satisfied. I was wondering about a few things. What is your concept of the age of proportionality? Which, when you showed the graphs and mentioned the data on Asia, makes so much sense. It's kind of China returning to its historical and proportional place in the world. With also incredible, striking, which you didn't emphasize so much, is the actual stability in the demographics of it. Although China had an incredible demographic growth over the last 100 years, it's a relatively stable proportion of the world's population. And now returning to its economic place. And of course, the important difference here is that the last time things were proportional, there was very little contact. Whereas now we're all living very closely together thanks to an integrated world economy and to modern transportation and communication. But I wondered also, okay, for China and let's say the OECD countries, very striking picture of return to proportionality. But what about the rest of the world? Are they? And there is a lot of talk about Africa, especially African economic growth, Brazilian, at least, taking also on a bigger role. But do you see these countries as joining in, or are they ultimately, maybe even including India, going to tail off, and it's going to be the West or the old OECD versus East Asia, as in China, basically, and a few of its neighbors? So is it a global proportionality, or is it an Asian Western proportionality? You also made the point about economic growth always being associated with rapid growth, or rapid economic growth always being associated with rapid increase in energy consumption, which is a standard tenet of economics, and which I've discussed with some colleagues quite recently, some younger colleagues, and that's what they taught us. That's the kind of 101, basic economics, that's how it always works. But do you think that's always going to be the case? Is it possible to see, to envisage, is it possible that there'll sometime be a situation in the near future or the not so near future when we can have quite rapid economic growth without expanding energy consumption? And I'm particularly interested, or I find the case of the US very interesting there, where there is reduced greenhouse emissions, and reduce consumption of coal, increase the use of gas, but also reduced imports of oil, partly to shale oil and to gas being used more for oil purposes, but also actually some reduced consumption of oil. There's a slight fall, which has been unthinkable for a century, that this would happen. And look also at American politics, where if you think of the Bush Jr. government, where George W. Bush Jr. and his family and a lot of the people around him have very strong connections with the American oil company. And the current government, very different. It is a lot of connections with other big companies, American companies, which make money in other ways than oil. So could there be some kind of, is a shift possible? And then for your inspiration, is the US kind of foreshadowing some shift here to a different kind of economy, more driven by communication and by high tech? Also, the rise of Korea again. They don't sell oil, so he said. So I'll just throw out a few more points before I stop. Or maybe just one point on the underlying geopolitical logic of what you're saying. This is a slightly complicated point, so I'm not sure if I can bring it out quite right. But as you one of the kind of really interesting points of your presentation is the increasing import dependency of China, and it's very interesting to see of the Southeast Asian countries, and of course of all the other countries, increasing dependency on what comes out of the especially the Gulf, and on the imports in general. And of course those imports, or the slocks, the sea lines of communication, which you had some maps of, or the country that influences those most is the US, with its navy, which is far superior to any navy in the world. And then obviously we have all these investments, especially in China, in trying to develop blue water navy. And then you mentioned, for example, in the case of a conflict with all of its neighbors, which China seems to be conflict with, including some of its non-neighbors, which is here. At some point, it would be possible for the US then to cut off oil supply. And here I have, and you, of course, this isn't quite fair because you didn't mention it, but I have a kind of I hear a kind of a traditional geopolitical logic. I have, as somebody who's worked a lot in the former Soviet Union, I think of the battle for Stalingrad, perhaps the key battle of the Second World War, which is basically the Nazis trying to cut off Soviet access to its oil and country. And many historians think that if the Nazis had won that battle, the Soviet Union would have gone down, and the Nazis would have then freed their hands to take over the rest of the world. And this is a kind of logic that a lot of geopolitical thinking goes by. And I just wonder, is it still valid? And maybe, to some extent, maybe not, but don't we need to think a bit more consciously about that? Because let's say the US cuts off oil from the Gulf to China, what would happen? First of all, or just preside one or mention one of these, that both China and the US are nuclear powers. Of course, China has a lot fewer nuclear weapons than the US, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the Chinese nuclear development. But could we be facing a situation at some point which like the one we had between the Soviet Union and the US, where you have the absolute deterrent? There is no way of stopping the other from exterminating you and the whole world as a result, in a nuclear Armageddon, and therefore will never fight directly. One has proxy wars and there's squibbles and so on, but one never fights directly. There's nobody wants to precipitate the end of the world. So could we be headed for that kind of development, which would then invalidate the whole kind of oil, or not invalidate it, but it would might weaken it But also, if we put aside that, which is a slightly complicated argument, which has some weaknesses, I still wonder, without kind of the nuclear threat, if the US, say China does something really brutal and abrupt about some of these islands in the East China Sea or South China Sea, and the US decides to take them the oil supply. The oil market is the world oil market. There are differences. We see the West Texas Intermediary Brent divergence up to $17 some period. But in the long term, this is a united market, and it is all held together with some bottlenecks and delays. And so, won't that? I mean, that will affect not just China, but it will affect everybody in the world oil market, and it will affect the US. Now, of course, what's very interesting is what if the US isn't dependent on supplies because it has its own shale oil? Very interesting factor to take into account. But shale oil, even for the most optimistic perspectives, it's going to take a while. So at least then does something about the time scale in the forward. And especially if you start thinking about all of the US allies, especially Europe, which is heavily dependent on oil imports, including from the Middle East and the Gulf, they would feel the pain probably almost as much as China. So I was just wondering, kind of some more reflections on this kind of geopolitical undercurrent. But also, thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Okay, then you should allow you, Michael, for responding to this, and then we can open the floor. Thank you so much, Indra, for your remarks. And you were right, I was very excited by Michael's.
Well, Indra, thank you very much for your very insightful questions and comments. In terms of the age of proportionality, it's hard to say, and of course economic prediction is very difficult. But one interesting study that was done in Australia by one of our leading economists did some economic modelling about GDP growth in the 20th century. And it used a range of scenarios about high growth scenarios, low growth scenarios. And the interesting thing was that despite whatever scenario was used, by the end of the 21st century, the modelling showed that by the end of this century there will be 4 giant economies in the world. And those giant economies will be Europe, US, China, India. And depending on which scenario you use, they might change in terms of which has the biggest, but those are the 4 that always come up, which I thought was quite interesting. So according to this, the real convergence will happen in parts of Asia, but and it will mean that there are these two giant economies in Asia, and then these 2 giant economies in the Atlantic. And it's quite interesting to think about how that will mean the world works. If there are 2 big centres of economic power. Africa, Latin America and so on, according to the modelling that was done, don't really start to figure. Japan falls away as a major economy. So that I would think that sort of modelling is probably quite robust in terms of predicting where we're going. In terms of the energy intensity of economic growth, it's a very good question. And a couple of observations about that. The first one is in relation to China. The latest figures I've seen is that China's energy intensity is starting to shift away from energy intensity in industry towards consumer energy intensity. So people wanting electricity to power their air conditioning and their refrigerators and so on, and their computers, but also the use of cars in China. Massive growth of cars, and of course the petrol needed to drive cars and the gas needed and so on. The other point you made was about the slight drop in US energy intensity. I wonder whether that will go up again with the discovery and exploitation of shale resources. And the stories we're starting to hear about US industry is starting to relocate back in America. So there are companies like GE leaving China and going back to America because it's had relatively restrained wage growth. It's got reasonably good infrastructure and, of course, energy. So suddenly you have the reindustrialization of the US. And I wonder whether we'll see the rise in energy intensity. But it's a good question whether future economic growth will be less energy intensive. Your point about the global integrated global energy market is a very good one. It's an extremely good point. But I guess my not very satisfactory answer to that is that I think events in the Ukraine show that force can be used in ways that are really quite creative in terms of being able to achieve or to be able to increase coercion without generalizing the pain in some ways. So I always think of the US quarantining of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a threat not to stop all shipping, but to stop and search ships. And that was enough to drive the Soviets to the brink and to cause them to back down. One of the things that people forget is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis blockade, a number of ships were allowed to go through, no problem, but it was the threat of ships being stopped and searched by the United States with a security rationale that really, I think, really affected Soviet resolve. And I think the Chinese worry about what would happen, how humiliating that would be to have the US Navy stopping Chinese shipping in the Indian Ocean, whether they wanted to stop it completely and turn it around or something, or just simply stopping it. I think that would have an effect as well on the Chinese, and that's probably why they feel nervous. Some of the maritime strategists, particularly in the US and places in Asia, are starting to suggest that what we might be seeing here is the end of an age of US maritime supremacy in the Asian region and the beginnings of an age of mutual sea deniability, where a lot of the maritime countries in Asia have enough maritime weapons to be able to threaten the shipping of each other. And this becomes a sort of a mutual standoff relationship. It's I think, quite a worrying situation to think about in the future because people can make miscalculations and things can go wrong. But I think that we're starting to see the weapons acquisition process that starts to bring about that sort of age. But thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I have a few people, but let me just ask one question first, or let's at least keep it in mind when you listen to some of the other questions, because to me it seems that you have two main arguments. You say, okay, the first is that we are living in an age of Asia Pacific, and you have this nice circle within the larger planet. It was very beautiful. But at the same time, you said in this Asia-dominated world or dynamics, you have on the one hand, you said remarkable interdependence. At the same time, you said remarkable rivalry. And you came out, as I understood, you're rather optimistic here. On the one hand, you said that, okay, there's so much interdependence that war is unlikely. At the same time, you said there's so much rivalry that some kind of organized cooperation, legal cooperation or stable framework is not very likely to happen. And then the kind of the trusted argument is then that slowly these things will go together somehow. At the same time, there will be kind of mutual adjustments of all. But now, it was your final remark that you hinted to, this might be a not so stable situation because something might happen.
Yeah.
So then returns to the issue of trust,
yes,
modes of communication, how you can sort out different disputes, etc., when they arise, etc., crisis coordinating mechanisms. So I'd like you to return to that, but I think I'll allow now for Sten Tønnesen. He's worked a lot on, he's one of the Norwegian experts working on Southeast Asia disputes, etc. So please, Sten. I leave here, we give you a microphone.
Thank you so much, and I'd also like to thank you for a really balanced, excellent presentation and with very good illustrations, both maps and graphs. I have one small remark, one big challenge, and two questions. The remark is just there is one big country with a small population that deserves some color too. That's Mongolia. Because Mongolia, I can tell you, they are worried about China's rights.
Yes.
They're much closer to the Russians. And they have not directly fought with China since 1920, but Russia has in 1969. My challenge is the one that Frederick just mentioned, because you have a very clear and strong view on the relationship between the rivalry, interdependence, and the possibility of war. I think I did not have my pen ready immediately, but I think you said that the rivalry will not develop into all-out conflict because of interdependence. And the powers can simply not fuel their war. It's as simple as that. I think that's what I heard you say. And there are in a way two arguments based on interdependence. One is the energy one that you emphasize very much. And I would say to that first that perhaps ask you at what point of import-export ratio would you say that the country is dependent on import from a security point of view? I would say you have to get up to about 70–80% import before I would call it dependence. I would say that Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and continental Europe are the really energy import dependent countries in the world. The United States has never been energy import dependent, although it chose to import quite a lot for a certain period. China also still has some 40% of its energy need, but it moves towards something I would call dependence. But I see that everyone seems to equalize net import surplus with dependence when they speak. That's kind of confusing. And the other thing is that I doubt that it's possible for the United States to cut off the oil supplies to China in the Indian Ocean. And only a certain proportion of the Chinese oil supply comes on Chinese ships. There is an open oil market. The United States has tried an embargo once before against Japan in the early 1940s. And even during the war, they were never able to completely cut off Japan from import of oil. It simply increases the price, and there will be people out there who take the risk and who ship oil. So when China both has a huge production itself and will continue to be able to import oil and can cut down enormously on its consumption because it can cut down on the civilian consumption and emphasize the military, I think China could be able to fuel a war for quite some time. And that presupposes a drawn-out war. A war could also be envisaged as a short exchange, and that would not require much fuel. So in a way, that's my challenge to the energy part of it. The other part of the argument normally, and I think that was presupposed also in your argument, because you mentioned the production networks, where China is in a way production platform for assembly, and it's only one proportion of the exports to China that are actually value added in China. Much of it comes from the rest of the region. This creates a system of interdependence which makes it extremely costly to go to war, because you will break down and you will simply lose income. And there will be people near the decision makers who tell them that this is so costly, so you must stay out of an absolute crisis. That's a pretty strong argument. One who argues it very strongly is Yi Chan in his book about the rivalries, called security rivalries or something like that. But then the question is, what happens before you get into the scenario that could lead to an all-out war? Something happens to the economy. And what happened before the Second World War was that you had a period of trade war with protectionism. That was extremely serious for Japan. And in his recent book, Stephen Roach, Unbalanced, which was just published by Yale University Press, he speaks about this interdependence as being extremely unbalanced. Because the region that you have talked about, they produce, but they consume very little, particularly China consumes very little, saves about 50%. And it invests in the United States, so that the United States can continue to consume without really producing and exporting. And this has created an extremely unbalanced world economy that could easily lead to tension and protectionist moves from the United States side. And that could repeat the kind of scenario where the interdependence would break down, and then the situation would develop where we could see development of war. So this is my challenge to you. My question is short. It's just, what do you think of New White's proposal for the United States to share power with China, Japan, and India in your region?
Okay, thank you so much. Martin, would you like to respond to
Sure.
these points?
It's nice to meet you. I've been reading your work for many years, and thank you for some very provocative comments. Mongolia is, I think, part of Asia's other security dynamic. In fact, the book I'm working on at the moment divides Asia horizontally. And in fact, this map is very nice over here. There is actually historically a chain of mountains that start in Turkey, that come down through mountains and deserts that come down through Iran, through the Himalaya range, and into Southeast Asia, that has historically, I think, divided a Southern Asian tier of security dynamics from a Northern Asian tier of security dynamics. And the argument I'm making in the book is that the Southern tier concentrates power and concentrates vulnerability. The Northern tier diffuses power and diffuses vulnerability. And the second part of the book really looks at the Northern tier sets of relations. What I set out today was my thinking around the Southern tier. And I think actually Mongolia is part of another peninsula, a land-bound peninsula in Central Asia, that could be the site of significant security competition between China and Russia into the future. In fact, if you go back into the history of China and Russia, it's a very long history, and they have a history of mutual antagonism that I think could explode into competition in some of these Central Asian republics, which I include Mongolia, the Stans, and Afghanistan as well. But I won't go into that. The point you make about energy and where dependence lies is an interesting one. I haven't really thought that through very much, and I'd be curious to know where you got your 70 to 80% figure from, and what's the thinking behind that. The way I tend to think about it is in terms of fuel types. Particularly what is needed to fight a modern war is aviation fuel. And aviation fuel, of course, is a processed fuel which is highly volatile. It's a highly specialized type of fuel. And of course, the more you process fuel, the more it's likely to break down. So you can't store it for long periods of time. And it all comes down to quite technical arguments about the refining capacity of a country like China. China is investing enormously in refining capacity. And there may be a stage that it gets to in which its aviation fuel refining capacity does have an ability to continue to produce refining fuel, but I don't think it's there yet. And I think the latest figures that I saw is that China probably has a maximum of 20 days of aviation fuel in its reserves, which would have to be a very short, sharp war before it worked. What are the prospects of escalation? Well, hopefully they're not high. I'm worried about the US concept of the air-sea battle. I think that is a highly escalatory battle concept that would turn nuclear very quickly. And so I guess my prediction of horizontal escalation is that it's a much more palatable way of pursuing mutually coercive policies than escalating through the air-sea battle. I mean, I think once the United States starts to bomb the Chinese mainland, it's a very, very fast route to nuclear escalation. Let me quickly move to Hugh's comments. Hugh's a colleague of mine, and he and I have debated for some time. I think that Hugh's recommendations are somewhat unrealistic for a number of reasons. The first one is a question of incentives. When and why do the Chinese and the Americans come to an agreement? The Chinese believe that history is on their side. Why would they settle now? They believe that the United States is finished, it's declining. Why settle now and not in 20 years when China can get not half of the Pacific, when China can get 80% of the Pacific? For the same reason, I think the Americans underestimate the Chinese rise. There are very few Americans that believe that China represents a fatal challenge to US power and believe that the United States can reassert itself. So I can't really see the basis on which this would work. My other problem is that the idea of some sort of great power concept presupposes great powers that basically agree on the rules of the road and the rules of the game. And I don't see China and the United States agreeing on that. I think if you start to go into their philosophical disagreements on areas like the South China Sea, they have very, very widely diverging views on, for example, what constitutes freedom of navigation. The Chinese and the Americans are poles apart on that, and something as complex as an agreement to share power in the Pacific. If they can't agree on what freedom of navigation is, I sort of struggle to wonder what they'll agree on in terms of a very complex power sharing agreement.
Okay, thank you. Then.
Thank you. My name is Marco Mazzeo. I'm with the Norwegian Peace Building Resource Center. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Probably picking up a little bit from the last point, and also going back to another country that technically is not part of Asia, but probably for Asia Pacific, which you didn't mention. My question goes to the role of Australia, and I know you've been writing about this for sure, and how the rise in Asia has an impact on how Australia's foreign policy is going to be projected. So I want to read a little bit more about that, also in light again of the big geopolitical shift that we've been discussing about the role of the US in the region, especially. Sorry, closer. Yeah. And also especially because it's a long trend. At the end of the 90s, the Pentagon brought up a report called Asia 2020, which was already portraying some of the big global threats. One being asymmetrical threats, mainly Al Qaeda and some of it, which unfortunately came true. And then the other one was China. And again, the US were clearly looking to Australia as a kind of trusted ally in the region. Now, this of course has some implication for the region itself, especially in Southeast Asia, given to the role that Indonesia itself wants to take as a regional kind of leader. So again, if you could elaborate a little bit on how Australia sees itself in this area. And the second question relates to the role of regional organizations. ASEAN has been, for a long time, sort of underestimated or left to the sideline as a completely ineffective kind of regional gathering. The last few years, probably because of this increasing power projection by China, is gained some new ground, new development. I was wondering how you're looking at, especially the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN, and maybe other trends in terms of regionalization, whether this could be counter trends to the escalation of rivalry that you mentioned. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Australia and ASEAN.
Okay. I might just refer to a bit of a map in a minute.
Go ahead. We have one here with the
yeah. Okay.
And you have one.
I have two responses really. In some ways, these power shifts in Asia are bringing Australia and the countries of Asia much more closely together, more closely than I think they have been for a long time. Australia, for example, shares with most of the other countries of Southeast Asia, and for that matter, North and South Asia, the fact that we are increasingly economically dependent on China, but we are increasingly dependent in a security sense on the United States and other US allies in the region. And that is something that we share fundamentally, and a desire to try and offset the tension between, if you like, the security and prosperity interests that we have. I think Australia, like other small countries in our part of the world, is going to be increasingly beset by what I call jealous great power relations, that the choices that we make, be it about the investment of a Chinese telephone company in our telephone infrastructure, or be it our willingness to sell uranium or not to a country like India, is watched very closely by Japan, India, China, the United States. And so I think we are entering a period in which even the smallest choices that we make can be interpreted and sometimes over-interpreted by our allies and some of our major trading partners as well. If I can just, well, can I just borrow the pointer? I think Australia is important in another sense, and that is, I was just responding to Stein about this idea of the air-sea battle concept. But I think there's actually a bigger game at play here. There's a lot of debate about the US pivot or the US rebalance into Asia. I actually think that a lot of it is a shadow play, and that there is something significant happening that no one really thinks about. And that is that the Chinese have the advantage in their anti-access area denial weapons. They can make it very dangerous for the United States to sail within this island chain, and to some extent out to here. I think there's a line that looks something like that, that means that Chinese surface-to-ship missiles can really endanger US battle fleets in this particular area. And so the concept is this air-sea battle concept that suggests that basically the United States can mount strikes against these missile zones and overcome this problem. But as I said to Stein, I think it's hugely escalatory and very, very worrying. But I think that what's really going on is a repositioning of US power, and it's repositioning in Guam out here, beyond the range of Chinese missiles. I think Darwin down here just makes the map, is another area. We talk about 2,500 US Marines in Darwin. What is less talked about is the fact that US B-52 bombers are starting to base in and out of the Northern Territory and fly from there, and that puts them within direct access of the Chinese mainland. And the third one brings the British in with Diego Garcia. So this is a pulling back of US strategic power, and again, it then puts the onus back on the Chinese. It says, okay, you have the strategic advantage in here, but once you start to demonstrate power out here, we have the strategic advantage in this broader ring. And I think, to my mind, that's essentially what the rebalance is about. It's not talked a lot about, but I think there's a lot of discussion in terms of interoperability, in terms of Aegis weapon systems and fighter systems and so on. That is the main game, I think, in the rebalance. And I think Australia is a part of that. It's a small part of it, but it's a part, and it's a very willing part. The interesting thing is that Australia is often seen as an ally of the United States that is very uncritical, that doesn't ask questions. I think Australia is playing a very interesting role in relation to China, because not many people know this, but the Australian Navy is the only foreign navy that has engaged in live fire exercises with the People's Liberation Army Navy. It did that, I think, in 2011, and there are plans to do that again later this year. And so Australia, I think, while quite clearly positioning itself as part of the US rebalance, I think is very serious about building offsetting relationships with China and trying to ease the tensions there. I think Australia is very cautious about becoming part of a containment coalition of China. I think that's unrealistic. China is now global, it can't be contained. But the last thing I think the Australian government would want to see was that it was seen to be becoming part of a mini NATO in Asia. That is a term that the Chinese increasingly use, and I think it's a term that Australian policy is trying to offset, if you like.
Okay, thank you. Ola Gunnar. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I wonder if you could give some thoughts on the effects of this economic shift from west to the east for the international economic system. Because this development is obviously going faster than what the creation of the system we have since the Second World War in terms of trade and finance and World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund. And I guess it could be solutions that you got a stronger international government, but at the same time it will be very difficult to agree which one. And you see, for instance, from Russia suggestion of the Eurasian Union, not only Ukraine should be within it, but also countries like India and China.
Yeah.
And at the same time, as you described, the middle class in the East is increasing, and in the West it's decreasing. So the demand stimulus is actually coming from the East, not from the West.
Yes.
That means that we should follow the Central Bank of China's behavior more than the Fed in the future. And then you have the role of the financial system too. So that would be very interesting if you can give some view on this challenge.
Thank you for that question. I have to admit that I'm rather pessimistic on this front, because I think what the implications of this is an increasingly heterogeneous international market. I think we came from a situation in the Cold War years in which you had a communist world and a capitalist world that basically didn't trade with each other, they didn't invest in each other. It was a stark division of the world. And within the non-communist world, you had the OECD and the rest. And within the OECD, you had you had some differences in economic approach and philosophy, but they were basically market economies. I think the situation we have now is one in which all countries are part of the world market economy now. With the exception of North Korea and Cuba, all countries have now become part of that economy. But I don't think you can say that there is a convergence of approaches towards markets in the international economy. I wonder very much about what, if you like, the Chinese model of capitalism is as it's emerging. I think within China at the moment it's very varied, but I think over time you can start to see certain approaches towards capitalism, the very strong reliance on state-owned enterprises and what that means, the different understandings of the legitimacy or not of the market, the different levels of comfort with market risk, and how risk is to be managed within the market, I think is starting to emerge. And so I think you have a period ahead in which there will be several different competing philosophies of how the market works and how it should work, which I think bodes not particularly well for the governance mechanisms of the international economy. I think that increasingly in organizations like the IMF, even the World Bank, you're starting to see real disagreements about the governance of the global economy and how it should work. And I think the corollary of that is a diffusion of market or economic mechanisms towards the regions. So organizations like the Chiang Mai initiative in Asia, which is an actual direct competitor to the IMF in terms of financial stabilization, in ways that can start to really compromise the role of the IMF as the arbiter of stability, financial stability and market discipline in the world. So I guess that's a very long way of saying that I think we are moving into an era of a very heterogeneous global market, that will be extremely difficult to moderate and control at a time when market fluctuation and instability is actually rising.
Okay, now we have a few more questions, but we're running out of time. So I collect a few questions. First, okay.
My name is my name is Ed. I come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, and I think the main gist of it, the importance of Asia globally, I think has been taken on board by our ministry for quite some time, and we've had various projects and so on to increase knowledge and understanding of this within the ministry, in the security field, Asia, in the High North, etc. But my question is, could I ask you to give us some advice, like or could you comment more specifically, what does the rise of Asia mean for Norway and for Norwegian foreign policy? And do you have some suggestions as to where should we focus our efforts? And as a corollary to the last question about what does it mean for the international economic system, what does the rise of Asia mean for the international normative system? And what does that again mean for Norway and like-minded countries? Thank you.
And then over here, please.
Hi, my name is Henry Keem. I'm a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. I also want to thank you for an excellent presentation. I have a question on crisis management and the potential for a crisis spinning out of control, because I think that's, that's one of the main worries in the region at the moment. A case in point would be the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, where there's increasing activity from both the Chinese and the Japanese. We know in the past that incidents have happened in the region, for instance in 2001 with the EP-3 US surveillance plane, which crashed with a Chinese aircraft. That was handled because of skillful diplomacy, but in the Chinese case, there's a real lack of crisis management mechanism. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that and potential for escalation.
Thank you for the question about the rise of Asia and Norway. I'm sure you're much more specialised on that than I am, but I have to say, while I've been in the Nordic countries, I've been listening with great interest about the impact on the Arctic system, and particularly let's just say, the growing presence of some of the rising Asian powers in some of the territories and countries in the Arctic system, and what that might mean, and the implications for the security and governance of the Arctic area. But my other answer to you would be along the lines of your the second part of your question, because I think really the big consequences of the rise of Asia are for the global governance system. And I think the reasons for that are as follows. I think I wrote an article that I published in the American journal, the American Interest, at the start of last year, which I called the new bipolarity. And by that I mean the growing divide, I think, in what I see as the Atlantic world and Asia in terms of the approach to global governance. And in that article I discussed a growing trend, certainly in Europe and North America, but also in Latin America and Africa, towards really quite strong liberal institutions of regional governance and domestic governance. As places like South America and Africa appear chaotic at times, but organisations like the African Union are really quite strong in their support of conflict resolution, interventions against conflict, but also the support of democratic processes, and their willingness in both Latin America and Africa to suspend countries from membership if they have coups or if they depart from democratic governance. In Asia, the situation I think is quite different. I forgot to answer your question about Asian institutions. Asian institutions have been purposely designed as weak and unable to address concerns if there are if there is any member of the institution that objects to an issue being discussed, then that issue can't be discussed. And I think the main difference is in Asia there is a much greater belief in what I called in the article the command power of the state. The state as the absolute centre of decision making, the custodian of economic well-being, and so on and so forth, and a complete rejection of a sense that international institutions should be able to override or constrain the actions of the state. And I think that is the key divide that is emerging in global governance, and you're starting to see it in organisations such as the IMF that I discussed before, but I think increasingly you're starting to see it in the WTO as well, and possibly in the G20 also. A completely different set of expectations and demands in terms of these global organisations, and that matters to small countries. It matters to Australia, it matters to Norway. I think one of the things that make Australia and Norway very similar is that we are aware that we're small countries, and small countries have a vested interest in building up international institutions in order to moderate the rule of the jungle, if you like. And we should be worried. Both of our countries should be worried and should be thinking a lot about how do you accommodate different approaches to global governance into these institutions in ways that continue the functionality of these institutions. I think we've reached a stage where, as a planet, we need to rethink our institutions of global governance. They are, for the most part, they date from the end of the Second World War. They were designed at the time by a very small group of countries, and they probably, in some ways, reached their use-by date. And I think, in terms of a significant rethinking of where we go from here, is something that our countries probably should be doing. In terms of the crisis management question, it's a very good question, and I worry, and there's been quite a bit of writing in Australia about the fact that in Asia there are no crisis management mechanisms that work. And in fact, China and other countries are opposed to the development of an incidents at sea code of conduct, such as existed between NATO and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. What we have in the South China Sea is a group of countries with not very well developed maritime doctrine, with quite powerful new weapons systems, and nationalist passions. And when you put all of those in together, plus a number of different disputants, I think it becomes quite a dangerous situation. So the mechanisms of crisis management are not well developed. There is a hotline between Washington and Beijing, but the fact is that it's rarely used, and it's rarely used because I think the Chinese quite often lack the confidence that they know exactly what to say when something like an EP3 incident occurs. One of the key developments in Asia has been the development of, let's call them national security councils. President Xi Jinping of China has just announced and set up a Council of State Security, which brings together the most powerful foreign policy and defense decision makers in China. The Japanese have done a similar thing, and I think that stems from a basic anxiety that the collective process of Chinese decision making are too slow. They're too slow to come to any sort of position when a crisis brews and a crisis breaks. So while, I guess my answer is that while China continues to have those anxieties about the flexibility and responsiveness of its decision making in the middle of crises, I think it will go very slow on crisis management mechanisms in case it's shown up, in case it looks like an amateur, and I think for that reason it does mean that if I was a betting man, I would say that there is quite a significant likelihood of a clash in places like the South China Sea. Where I'm more optimistic is whether such a clash will develop into a much broader war.
Okay, final question, very brief, from Harry Björnai. All right. Yeah, very short, very short. And then a short response. Maybe we could go on for a long time. It's a very interesting conversation. So there's. Go ahead, please.
I'll try my best to make this short. Yeah, my name is Björn Sverre. I'm a research fellow here at NUPI. Thanks again for a great lecture. I think one of the particularly interesting things, as has been mentioned there earlier, is the way you draw the lines between the development internally in the Asian countries and how that translates into the foreign policy arena. One thing it would be interesting to have you elaborate on in accordance to that is how your argument about how the integration in East Asia will make it less likely for any conflict to occur is basically based on the idea that no country would want to let down the growing middle class through doing something rash internationally that might hamper the economic development. What could be interesting is to see to what degree this rising middle class, as you pointed out, might also be a destabilizing factor.
Yes.
Particularly, we see right now the big spat going on between China and Vietnam over the origin, and how China, in international politics, point one, seek to secure the middle class by securing the oil supplies, by dodging the Malacca dilemma, making them pushing on all more aggressively in South China Sea. Being one effect, the other effects on how the middle class plays in is how they might seek to relieve internal tensions by a more nationalistic posture abroad, which might also have a double effect on raising tensions in China's neighborhood, and how that might make a spark lead to a very rapid escalation.
That's a great question.
Michael, could you just collect one more
Sure.
before you start responding, because that will be the final one from over here, please.
Thank you so much for squeezing me in, and I apologize I missed it, but I'm so glad it's taped. My name is Teresa Fallon. I'm with the European Institute of Asian Studies, and I'm based in Brussels. I came to Oslo yesterday to attend the special conference on Norway sending a ship to RIMPAC. It just departed yesterday. So I compliment the defense minister. She's so well spoken and very impressive, and this is a good signal, I think. It's one ship, but it's a signal as they participate in RIMPAC. So my follow-up question to that is, what can Europe do? Because in Europe there are two debates going on. One is strategic marginalization. We have all these problems. We live in a very dangerous neighborhood. We need to invest a little more and take care of our own defense. And another is, well, we live in a global, geopolitics are these tectonic shifts towards Asia. What is Europe going to do? And my view is that China is really very carefully trying to neutralize Europe and not have them speak with one voice in this region. They've been very effective in doing that. Other countries do the same thing. They can divide Europe very easily. It's hard to get 28 countries to speak with one voice. So, and the second question is about TTIP, because it's kind of, as Brian Spiegel from Financial Times said, it's like two old, kind of worn-out countries getting together, trying to pool their resources and help set global norms. What's your take on that? Because in Asia it's TPP, in Europe and the US, transatlantic, it's TTIP. Do you see this maybe working, or what's your take on that? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The middle class is a great question, and there are so many responses to it. Of course, the middle class in China is increasingly nationalistic. This kind of narrative of national humiliation is playing much more, and Of course, this is partly the government's doing because this is all through the textbooks and so on. But I think there are signs that we've reached a stage where the Chinese government is a bit afraid of its own popular nationalism, and there are signs that there is a concern that if the Chinese government plays a crisis in the wrong way, then suddenly they could find massive demonstrations occurring which forces their hands in ways that they don't particularly want them to be forced. So that kind of demon of nationalism is to some extent, a bit of a danger to the Chinese government as much as impelling it along. But I don't think it's only in China. I mean, in Japan, I think the Yasukuni Shrine issue is a sign that there are elements of the Japanese society that have said enough already. We're sick of apologising. This is Japan. This is who we are. You want us to become a normal country? Well, being a normal country is being proud of our history, and everyone else should get over it. So I think there are very broad elements to this that are, quite worrying, but also in ways quite reassuring as well. So the middle class issue is a really important one to play in here, and of course the new social media is a part of it, and so on. In terms of what can Europe do, I'm not sure I'd agree with your or the quote you made about Europe and America being these two tired old economies. I don't see it in that way at all. I think that that Europe and the United States will be two major centres of not only the global economy but global governance in the years ahead, and for that reason they both have a major role in the world that evolves. So a country like Australia, which firmly believes in global governance and liberal rules of global governance, clear rules of global governance, there's very little we can do in our own region because we're small. We are heavily economically dependent on China. We are subject to all of the tectonic forces among these great powers. Europe and the United States have two great benefits and great advantages. They're big economically, they're big strategically, they're weighty. They are somewhat removed, so they're not involved in the day-to-day rivalries that are occurring in that part of the world, and they are deeply committed to these rules of global governance, these liberal rules of global governance. So I think Europe and the United States have a crucial role to play in Asia.
Okay, thank you very much, and that concludes this session. I would like to thank you, Michael, for coming here, sharing your thoughts, partly kind of having a very nice presentation, but also engaging in the discussion. And I think that you're several things that I at least take away, and one is that you're kind of your overview of some of the general questions and issues at stake, but at the same time your kind of willingness to contribute with kind of more specific issues, etc. So, and your willingness to kind of be a bit outspoken and frank on some of these things, I think is very refreshing and it's enlightening. And I also like to pick up on kind of the remark you had made that Australia and Norway should have some kind of commonalities. We have, although we are on different sides of the planet, but we have faced some of the same challenges, and then there's some potential benefits for probably some governmental cooperation, but also I think for us as researchers, we should stimulate more cooperation, and we look forward to doing that with you and other Australian colleagues. So on that note, I'd just like to thank you all, and also thank Idra for his remarks. So thanks. Have a nice day.